This video looks at the topic of denazification and re-educating the German people. It's the last lesson for the fourth depth study, so we'll push straight into the details. Denazification and re-education. Do the usual as you're playing the video. I've uploaded a mind map and the notes, lesson notes, so hopefully you've got those printed off. The lesson notes is the same text as the slideshow, but I've also included in the slideshow some additional information, including some scans from Williamson. If you look at the reading here, there's a little bit in Turner, not too much in Turner about denazification. Likewise, not very much in Carr. Williamson is the best source, and it's all in chapter 2, pages 11 to 15. So I've included quite a few scans of the relevant sections from Williamson into the slideshow, which as we go through the slideshow, as before, pause and make notes. So there's the list of possible questions that I've just selected from various sources. As you can see, there are 3. How successful was denazification in the years 1945 to 60? That's on page 61 of the revision guide. How far do you agree that the Allied denazification process in the years 45 to 49 was mainly a failure? That's also on the same page of the revision guide. To what extent did West Germans come to terms with their past in the years 1949 to 60? And again, page 63 of the revision guide. On all of those pages of the revision guide by Alan Farmer, there's guidance and suggestions about how to plan your answer to those questions. Because this is the last lesson on the depth study, next lesson we'll be moving into the breadth study. We've got three lessons on the breadth study, economic development. So far with our breadth study, we've followed the story through to 1945, so we'll be picking it up after World War II and looking at West Germany's economic miracle 1948 to 63. So I've said for this one, if you can read chapter 6 of Williamson, the whole of that chapter, in advance of next lesson, that's chapter 6, and I'll upload that to the area, the shared area, along with the resources for this particular lesson, so you can download it. And there's the mind map for this lesson. Starting off in the top right hand corner there with the beginning, we'll move our way through those key strands: the Frogiboga, the American questionnaires, re-education, the relaxation of the denazification program from 46 onwards, and then the last 3 strands are very much about the issues, Adenauer's policies, the politics of the past, how Germans responded to it at the time, and the debate. So, the beginning, 3 strands there: the Potsdam decisions that were made, the 5 Ds, and the Nuremberg trials. Right. So, introduction. Millions of Germans had supported Hitler's rise to power. Obviously, we're aware of that. That there were different degrees of support, remember. Support is a very broad term, from active support to passive support. But most Germans in one way or another had given some form of support to Hitler at some point. And certainly many Germans had associated with the Nazi Party in one way or another after 1933. For example, joining mass organisations like the German Labour Front, the Hitler Youth Movement. Many Germans had voluntarily joined, others had compulsorily joined, but nevertheless most Germans had been associated with the Nazis in one way or another, even though active membership of the Nazi Party was only about 10% of Germans. Now, that posed a dilemma after World War II for the post-World War II German politicians, because, of course, the decision was that Germany would become a democracy, and therefore, if it's going to become a democracy, the German people need to be represented. But by giving the Germans the vote, you're going to include the same people, the Nazis, supporters of the Nazis, who had destroyed democratic freedom before 1945. And who had crushed opposition parties. There is the dilemma. So obviously the issue is who are these people? Now, a minority of Germans were active members of the Nazi Party. A minority of Germans were active opponents of the Nazi Party, but the vast mass of Germans in the middle had given some form of degree of support for the Nazi Party. But trying to decide who the active Nazis were and who the more passive and who the opponents were was difficult. So the West German politicians had to find a way of dealing with these events if they're going to admit people into the democratic process of making decisions about Germany's future. So this was talked about at Potsdam, and certainly at the Potsdam Agreement it was agreed that the Nazi Party had to be completely destroyed after the war, and the leading Nazis put on trial for being war criminals. That was very much part of the agreement for what we call the 5 Ds that was agreed at Potsdam: to denazify Germany, to demilitarize Germany, to democratize Germany, to decentralize Germany, and to decartelize Germany. To the last one is the concern over the dominance of huge big business concerns that had backed Hitler, put Hitler into power, and had supported the Nazi regime. They also agreed that all members of the Nazi Party were to be removed from key positions in the public and private administration. Okay, so this is the Allies, including the Soviet Union. Okay, so the Americans, the British, the French, and the Soviet Union, joint agreement. In their zones, they would all work together to completely destroy the Nazi Party. Now, if you look to the right of this page, I've given you a scan from Williamson, pages 11 to 12, and there's information there about the trial of leading Nazis for war crimes at Nuremberg, the Nuremberg trials. So pause this video at this point and just pull out a few key points. I've highlighted for you some of the key points, but pull those out and add those to your notes. Okay, so we now move into what we call the Frogiboga, the questionnaires, and the two strands to pull out here are the implementation of the questionnaires and then the weaknesses of the scheme that provoked a lot of complaints, even though the Americans very much pushed on with it. Okay, so the Frogiboga. So the Frogiboga was the denazification policy in the American zone. Okay, so the US policy was to introduce a questionnaire that would decide who could be classed as a Nazi. This was their way of identifying. 133 questions in total, over 12 pages. There's a scan on the right there, an image on the right that shows the front page of a typical questionnaire. People were asked about their jobs, the jobs of their friends and relatives, who they voted for in 1933. And remember, the Nazi vote in March 1933 was 43.4%. Sorry, 43.6%. So nearly half of Germans did vote for the Nazi Party in 1933. They were asked whether they were Junkers, because obviously the Junkers had given other forms of support for the Nazi Party and putting them into power. They were asked questions about what scars they had, the number of bank accounts. All Germans had to complete the Fragebogen. Okay, all German adults. 13 million were printed in total, and this included inmates of concentration camps had to complete the Fragebogen. The American philosophy was everybody was a suspect of being complicit with the Nazis unless they could prove otherwise. That outraged Kurt Schumacher, the leader of the SPD, who, as we saw, had been imprisoned in Dachau for 10 years. And many Germans complained for other reasons. They claimed that the questions were very difficult to comprehend because they had been badly translated. The questions also relied on Germans having good memories of events from many years before. Many of the questions were about the period before Hitler took power. Many of the questions were heavily weighted, which were very difficult to answer in one sentence, such as, had they hoped that Germany could win the war? Such answers may have changed at different times in the early 1940s. The answers had to be very carefully phrased, because if they were poorly worded, in such a way that it might suggest that the person filling in the questionnaire was right-wing or supported militarism, then that could have disastrous consequences. Because remember, the purpose of these questionnaires was to identify who the Nazis were, or who the consequences could be imprisonment, not being given employment, and so on. Many Germans complained that membership of Nazi organisations had been almost compulsory under the dictatorship, which of course was a fact. The German Labour Front, as we said. Hitler Youth became compulsory eventually in 1939. And so association with a Nazi organisation did not necessarily mean that that German was a Nazi. But the US held to their view. They were very firm, and that they said if you do not complete the Fragebogen, you will not qualify for state relief such as rations or find employment. Now, I've scanned for you, and you've got the hard copy of Williamson, pages 12 to 13. And I put a question there for you. I think at this point it would be useful just to pause the video for 5 minutes and pull out some key points there. And what I've said, compare and contrast the different approaches to the management of denazification by the four allies in their different zones. The information which we've just gone through was taken from the textbook. And as you saw, that was all about the denazification process in the American zone. But the textbook, bizarrely, doesn't talk about the British zone, the French zone, or the Russian zone. And you need that information, or certainly if you're going to answer a question in the examination, it's a great opportunity to show that your answer is stronger than those who are just using the textbook. So there's some good information here on pages 12 to 13 about, first of all, about the Russians, how they applied denazification in their zone, then the Americans in the middle bit, and then towards the bottom there, the British and the French, going over onto the next page. So just pause the video and just pull out some key points. So as you can see, of all four powers, the power that introduced the most coherent and well-organised denazification programme were the Russians. And effectively, as is pointed out there, you've got that point, that key point, just highlighting it for you here, that in the Russian zone, because the Russian they occupied the eastern zone of Germany, remember, and it was the eastern zone that was primarily the old Prussia, where most of the traditional elites were based. And as Williamson points out, they decisively broke the power of the traditional elites in East Germany, systematically weeding out Nazi officials such as judges, teachers and industrialists, consciously implementing what the German Revolution of 1918 had failed to achieve. That's an interesting comparison, which would be a good point that you could make yourself. Then you got the bit about the Americans, and as it points out, it proved to be largely it could not be implemented. It became a bureaucratic nightmare. We'll move on to that in a second. The British and the French more pragmatic, it points out there, focusing more on long-term re-education and a surgical approach, removing former Nazis in responsible positions in industry or public administration. So unlike the Americans who tried to weed out former Nazis from any position, the British and the French accepted the fact that probably was not going to be possible. So they focused more on the higher levels of industry and public administration, and thought more in terms of a long-term approach of re-educating the German people, which we'll move on to in a second. Oh, in fact, we'll move on to it now. Okay, so re-education. You can see the sort of key strands there. What was decided at Potsdam, the US zone, the British zone, the French zone, and the universities. Again, the textbook, very weak. In fact, virtually nothing in the textbook about re-education. So this is, again, a key opportunity just to really make sure your notes are stronger than that of other students in other schools who are sitting this exam, who would not have this sort of detail. Williamson includes it. So there are the key pages in Williamson on re-education. So again, pause the video and make notes. So what you have, as you can see, is first of all what was agreed at Potsdam. It was agreed by all four powers that they needed to re-educate the German people, that after 12 years of Nazi rule, the German people had been exposed to, particularly the younger generations, to Nazi ideology, and that needed to be removed by re-educating the German people. So it laid down that both militarism and National Socialism were to be eliminated in order to make possible the development of democratic ideas. There was agreement, I'm just picking out my underlined bits here, that secondary education should be free, and that German schools began to open very quickly in late summer 1945, but in very, very difficult conditions, appalling conditions. And he gives examples of that, classes of over 120, for example, in Schleswig-Holstein. Nazi teachers were suspended, Nazi textbooks were destroyed, new books were hastily issued. In fact, most of them were just old pre-1933 editions. But they then quickly realised they had to be discarded because they were too nationalistic. Teacher training colleges were hastily opened to produce more teachers, and useful statistics there. For example, by Easter 1946, 28 had been set up in the British zone. I won't read through the rest of it. You can pick out the key points yourself, but there's a section there about the education policies in the Soviet zone, which, as is highlighted there, failed dismally. And it then moves into the French and the British zones. And then on the next section, you've got the American zones. And then at the end, you've got the universities, policies towards the universities. So again, pick out sort of key points and add those to your notes. Moving on then. As I've said, the denazification policies that the Allies signed up to at Potsdam in 1945, there was a genuine commitment to weed out the Nazis. But in practical terms and for other reasons, denazification did not work until eventually 1948 through to 1951, it was pretty much completely abandoned. Certainly by 1951, denazification it was generally admitted, had failed. So let's pick up the sort of key points here. So again, there's a useful extract from Williamson there, page 13, about the failure, the abuses, the over-bureaucratization of the denazification program. Okay, so just zooming in here, but if you just pause it and pull out some of the key points to say, as you can see, denazification quickly ran into major problems. Out of sheer necessity and self-interest, all the four occupying powers had to turn a selective blind eye to the employment of Nazis in key positions. There were so many potential Nazis, they simply couldn't refuse to employ all of them. And so a key turning point there in October 1946, what has been called the most important law passed in Germany during the occupation, divided the Germans into 5 categories. So we'll pick up those points. And as you can see at the end there, by 1948, the four occupying powers had each declared the process to be at an end. So pretty much failed. So it's a good section from Williamson there. Just take a pause and pull out some key points and jot them down. So what are those key points? First of all, the rigorous denazification, the Frogiboga in the American zone, by trying to weed out anybody who had a Nazi association, effectively depleted Germany of key workers that were needed to rebuild the country. And we've already covered that by 1946-47. Already, the British and the Americans in particular are saying, well, we've got to give our zones back to the Germans, and the Germans have got to start rebuilding, because in particular Britain had too many problems elsewhere to be able to manage the German zone themselves. But if you're going to forbid anybody with a Nazi past from having employment, then there were not going to be enough key workers to rebuild the country. There were also, in any case, too many cases to get through. In one Länder alone, remember, a land is a state, 2.5 million Germans were being investigated. So in total, for example, the USA had to try approximately 170,000 denazification cases. So that's once they've identified from the questionnaires the ones to put on trial, which became a bureaucratic nightmare. So very quickly, by the end of 1946, and remember I think the date was October 1946, from Williamson, all four occupying powers began to relax. They had no choice. So rather than just have a single category, you are a Nazi, they decided to have 5 categories, and from lesser to more serious. Lesser offenders, such as those who belonged to Nazi organisations but were not directly associated with crimes, were placed on probation for 2 to 3 years and were allowed to return to work. So many card-holding Nazis, many Germans who had been active members of the Nazi Party because they were not directly associated with crimes, were allowed to return to work. So from 1946 onwards, the Americans released thousands of Germans who they had in 1945 and early 1946 had found to be guilty and had basically imprisoned them. So thousands of imprisoned ex-Nazis were released. In addition, responsibility for managing the denazification procedures was then increasingly delegated to the Germans themselves. So in the early months, 1945 to 46, the various tribunals and courts were staffed by Americans, but there were so many cases they couldn't handle it, so they started to hand over that role to the Germans themselves. So the tribunals were being run by Germans to deal with questionable cases, and it was the Germans' responsibility to categorise the individuals. So working out which of the 5 categories, that job was given to Germans to make those decisions. So that's part of the general process that was happening 1946 through to 1949, where gradually more and more of the running of the Western zones was being handed over to the German people. We've already talked about that in terms of the economy and ultimately in terms of politics. Culminating in 1949 to the creation of West Germany. Well, this was likewise happening with denazification. So those changes made a lot of sense. They were common sense. The process did become more efficient, but it still was overwhelming. E.g., 1947, 90,000 Germans had been categorised as serious offenders and therefore were confined in prison camps. The process was also subject to a lot of corruption, e.g. black market certificates to prove that you were not a Nazi. So by 1948, many people in the West realised that the denazification policies that had been introduced in the Western zones had become, quote, a full-fledged fiasco. That's a quote by a historian called I.D. Turner. Not the Turner from the book that we're using, but another Turner. Also, within this same time period, of course, you've got growing Cold War tensions. And so as those tensions increased, a new enemy has now appeared. If you're in the American and British zone, the new enemy, of course, is the Soviet Union. And as a result, ex-Nazis are less of a priority. So that was another factor that ultimately all of this came together, and in 1951 the USA officially ended its program of denazification. So we reached that crucial year then, 1949, when it was recognised that the Germans in the Western zones that had already come together economically into Trizonia now should form a political entity, and a West German state was created, and the West Germans were given responsibility to run their own affairs under Chancellor Adenauer. So this next section is then about how Adenauer handled the issue of denazification, because with the creation of the West German state, the responsibility for denazifying Germany was passed over to the West German state. Adenauer believed that his absolute priority must be to construct a stable society. And in order to construct a new stable Germany, he needed to have experienced and efficient Germans in government positions. In 1951, he justified this by saying many years had passed since the Nazi regime had ended. Well, it was 6 years, which made it difficult to accurately assess guilt. And that policy, known as politics of the past, or in German, Vergangenheitspolitik, effectively opened the way to annulling many of the Allied punishments for millions of Germans who the British and the Americans and the French had been deemed to be Nazi criminals. Now, we've already seen how, even before 1949, many Germans that had been judged as being serious offenders had been released from prison, simply because they were not directly complicit in crimes, even though they had been active Nazis. Well, now in 1951, Adenauer issued a series of laws that effectively benefited nearly 800,000 Germans who had been previously classified as Nazi criminals. Now, that first amnesty law was passed in May 1951, and it allowed 150,000 German officials who had been classified as Nazis to return to their old jobs in government administration. Then, in 1954, 3 years later, Adenauer's government, through the Bundestag, through the German parliament, passed a second amnesty law, and that annulled the process of denazification in the old British zone, giving amnesty to nearly another 500,000 Germans who had been previously declared Nazi criminals. So let's look at the impact of the amnesty laws and other measures that were passed. So the impact. As a result of those laws, high numbers of government civil servants took positions in top levels of the West German government, in the Foreign Office and in new government departments. And these people had previously worked for the Nazi Party. So, for example, and this is one of the highest profile cases, Hans, so that should be Hans, there should be an S after the end there, Hans Globke, who was Adenauer's chief of staff in the West German Chancellery Office for 10 years from 1953 to 63. He had a Nazi past. Now, many people at the time did not know about it. It did hit the news later on in the early 60s and became something of a scandal. But nevertheless, he was one of many very senior Nazis who were able to take up new positions in the West German state. So what was his past? He was a lawyer. He had been involved in the drafting of do you remember the 20th of July Prussian coup d'etat? That was 6 months before Hitler took power, effectively when von Papen was Chancellor. The SPD had been overthrown in the Prussian government, and effectively a dictatorship under von Papen had been set up in Prussia, and that was an opportunity that Hitler was able to use because it created a precedent that he built upon in his own legal revolution 6 years later. Globke had also, as a lawyer, been involved in the drafting of Hitler's Enabling Act, and he was also involved in the drafting of the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, that removed Jewish citizenship and forbade them from having sexual relations or marrying non-Jewish Germans. So, in addition, many former members of Hitler's RSHA, and that was effectively the Hitler's police force. Remember, all the different branches of the German police force were ultimately pulled together into a central office called the Reich Main Security Office that was created in 1939, which was basically the under the control of the SS, the RSHA. Well, many former members of Hitler's RSHA, in other words, members of the SS, were able to take up positions again in the West German police and in the West German internal security forces. So, putting it simply, there were many Nazis who were now working for the West German government. Very controversial. Equally controversially, these policies had political gains for Adenauer. Because you have to realise that this obviously created a huge amount of debate, not just since Adenauer, but at the actual time itself. There were many Germans, there were many people in other countries who were very critical of the fact that this was happening and this was being allowed to happen. And we'll unpick some of those arguments in a minute. But one of the criticisms was, of course, Adenauer politically gained. It helped him to keep himself in power. Why was that? Because many of these people were on the right wing of politics. And as we've already seen, Adenauer was reliant in the Bundestag on forming coalitions with other right-wing parties. We did that a couple of lessons ago. Certainly until 1957, in the first 8 years of Adenauer's rule, the CDU were the governing party, but they did not have a majority. And they could not form a coalition with the SPD, so therefore they were forced to look for other political parties, including the FDP, and the other political parties on the whole were more on the right wing of the spectrum. So the politicians that were supporting Adenauer in this period, they had a past. They had been active in politics before Hitler in the 1920s and early 1930s. And these people justified their policies as being, well, we needed to back Hitler because we needed to remove communism. The reason we backed Hitler was we were being anti-communist, and we were supporting Hitler to maintain strong German unity. Nice little quote there, the British High Commissioner, who Ivan Kirkpatrick: "Whenever I travelled, I ran into ghosts of Hitler's Reich, taking jobs in banks, commerce or industry." That's an outside observer noticing how many ex-Nazis were in key positions throughout West Germany. Other measures taken by Adenauer to address the legacy of Nazism. Adenauer was aware of the threat of extreme right-wing politics and did attempt to deal with the legacy of Nazism. So this, of course, would be how he would have countered criticism. When he was criticised, well, you are supporting ex-Nazis, he would have clearly said, no, I am not supporting ex-Nazis. I am simply putting efficient people into key positions so we have a stable country, a stable democratic country. I am anti-Nazi, and the evidence of that is I am tackling radical right-wing extremist groups so that Nazism cannot revive. So evidence of that, August 1952, there was a neo-Nazi group. Neo-Nazis were basically Germans who were trying to resurrect the Nazi party under different names. The most famous extreme right-wing neo-Nazi group were called the SRP, the Socialist Reich Party. There's a photograph there of the SRP leaders in August 1952, Doris Raymer and Wolf von Westarp. And in August 1952, they were banned. Adenauer banned them. The SRP accused Adenauer and the Christian Democrats of being American puppets. The SRP claimed that the Holocaust was a lie, that it hadn't happened, that it had been faked by the Americans for propaganda purposes. So the various films of American soldiers liberating the death camps, the SRP claimed that they were just staged. In 1951, the SRP had actually won 11% of the vote in Lower Saxony in a state election. Now, that Lower Saxony was one of the areas that had been very strong supporters of Hitler and the Nazis, and they won that 11%. So Adenauer swiftly dealt with this group by banning them in his defense. In his defense, Adenauer paid the new state of Israel 3 billion German marks in compensation for Germany's treatment of the Jews during the Holocaust. The new state of Israel had been formed after World War II as a new homeland for Jews, for European Jews or Jews around the world, because of course they did not have their own homeland before that. So the next strand then is, let's unpick the sort of key arguments. How would So Adenauer has been accused of repeating the mistakes of the Weimar Republic, because what he was effectively doing is he was promoting into senior government positions ex-Nazis because they were anti-communist. And in the context of the 1950s, the beginning of the Cold War, Adenauer's key priority was the key enemy was the Soviet Union and the new East German Democratic Republic. So Adenauer's main focus was stopping communism spreading into West Germany. So therefore, Adenauer wanted to integrate West Germany with the West, with Britain, France and America. So very much he was focused on anti-communism. And therefore the critics of Adenauer are saying, well, are you not doing exactly the same as Hebert did in 1919 when he formed a pact with Groener, the Hebert-Groener Pact, when key Prussians after the war, were kept in their jobs to stop communism spreading. You're basically repeating the mistakes of the past, was the accusation. So there is clearly a lot of factual basis in that. Okay, so the accusation repeating the mistakes of the past. And as you know, in the 1920s, the Prussian Junkers, who had been kept in their positions, had used their positions to make Weimar democracy unstable. They were supposed to protect democracy, but they weakened democracy and put Hitler into power. So at the time, many people criticised Adenauer and said, you're making the same mistake and therefore you are running the risk of history repeating itself. If you put key Nazis into key positions in West Germany, then at some point in the future, democracy will become unstable and a new Hitler will take control of West Germany. So, Adenauer's defence. He made the crucial point that the context of the 1950s was very, very different from the context of the Weimar Republic in the 1920s. He said, we have a strong democratic state with a different constitution, a better, stronger constitution than the Weimar Republic. And we have a divided Germany in which the east of Germany is communist. And so therefore, if West Germany as a democratic state is going to win the battle against the communist East Germany, that is a very different context from the old Weimar Republic. Why? Because these ex-Nazis, who I have put into key positions in West Germany, are working for democracy. They're not working against it. Whereas, of course, the Prussian Junkers, who were put into or kept in key positions in the 1920s, had always actively worked against West German democracy, whereas these ex-Nazis who are now working for the West German state are working for West German democracy because they are working against East Germany. So, for example, in 1952, Adenauer told the Bundestag that although 66% of Foreign Office diplomats were former Nazis, and that's an astonishing figure, 2 out of every 3 diplomats, and these are ambassadors, these are people working abroad, West Germans working abroad in consulates and embassies, 66% of them were former Nazis. It was necessary to ensure proficient functioning of the Foreign Office in its struggle against the Communist East, because this conflict to prevent communism is not an internal issue, it is an external international issue. So these ex-Nazis, because let's face it, Nazis have got a huge amount of experience in dealing with communism. That's what Nazism, a key element of what Nazism was about hatred of communism. They've got a lot of experience in rooting out communism and weakening communism. Therefore, they can make a significant contribution to the long-term survival of West Germany. And therefore, by virtue of that fact, if they can strengthen the long-term survival of West Germany and all this will contribute to West Germany becoming prosperous and strong, and therefore will become a magnet. It's that magnet theory again, that a weak, poor East Germany, the people living, the 17 million Germans, will therefore be attracted to the West, and that will open the way for a reunification of Germany in the future. Next point, Adenauer also argued that sympathy for Hitler's policies had also not simply evaporated in 1945. Now, this was a very, very controversial point, but he was brave enough to say, look, some things that the Nazis did worked. They were genuinely popular. They worked. We can't just pigeonhole everything that the Nazis did as being evil, as being racist. There were some policies that worked. And we have to reckon with the fact that the Nazis were genuinely popular with most German people at some point in time for some reason. And it was a very complex situation as to the support that the Germans gave to the Nazis. We've already looked at that in the third depth study. So, for example, the German Labour Front, Robert Lie's Labour Front that was created, mass membership of all German workers following the destruction of the trade unions. What did it do? It brought about harmony into the workplace. It ended conflict between employers and employees. It introduced all sorts of schemes, package holidays, trips to the theatres, etc., that improved the well-being and happiness of German people to a point. So we have to recognise that. So relentlessly pursuing everything that the Nazis did as being criminals is actually in denial, because we have to reckon with the fact that the Nazis were genuinely popular for some of the things that they did. So we've got to basically temper our approach with common sense and flexibility rather than pigeonholing every person with a Nazi past as if they were evil. So that's the sort of point that he bravely made there. And of course, by making that point, he exposed himself to a lot of criticism. Adenauer also believed that attacks against every aspect of the Nazi regime would open up old wounds. It would create divisions. And he said, we've got a responsibility to heal Germany and move on. if we just simply allow these old wounds to reopen, then we're going to get a divided country. And what was wrong with Germany in the 1920s? Germany was divided. That was not good. It opened the way for the Nazis to take power. So we've got to temper this with common sense. We've got to focus on unity and moving on, so that democracy will survive in the long term. So, reactions of the time. Put into 2 points alongside each other, negative and positive. So, the negative, first of all, there were definitely some public movements against Adenauer's willingness to work with Nazi sympathisers. Examples of that: protests at Göttingen University in Lower Saxony. The government had to withdraw its appointment of Leonhard Schlüter as Minister of Education because of his Nazi past. So a lot of the anti-Adenauer protests was through the universities. The opposition party, the SPD, perhaps unsurprisingly, took a stance against many of Adenauer's policies here. So examples of key people: Carlo Schmidt and Walter Menzel spoke out against the amnesty laws. Pick these up in your own reading, Google them, do some research, find out a little bit more about these people, just to strengthen your answers. On the other side, though, Adenauer had many supporters, and on the whole, they were supported. Most of the SPD backed Adenauer's policies. So yes, over here we said some SPD members were critical, but the SPD themselves were divided, and the majority of the SPD supported the social cohesion argument that Adenauer had used. We've got to move on. We've got to promote stability and remove conflict within Germany. The older generation, in particular Germans, did want to move on with their lives, rebuilding the economy and improving living standards. And then the final strand, the debate since Adenauer, the politics of the past. If you just go to Amazon and type in politics of the past, you'll see a range of books that have been written in the last 50 years about this controversial topic. So in the 1960s, a cultural revolution. 1960s was the decade of protest across the whole of the world. Okay, every country in the world. It was a time of great excitement. It was the baby boom generation. A lot of babies born in 1945, the year the war ended. They hit adulthood in the early 1960s, and it obviously provoked, out of that grew the youth movements and protests, etc., etc. Well, the same with West Germany. There was a real bulge in the 1960s of young German adults, who spoke out very strongly. And these are Germans whose parents and grandparents had been associated with the Nazis, and they challenged Adenauer. They said, we cannot forget the policy of forgetting the politics of the past. We cannot simply move on, that there is a responsibility to keep alive Germany's Nazi past. We've got to continuously debate it. If we forget Germany's Nazi past, then history may repeat itself. And of course, that is an ongoing debate, and it's still very, very important. We generally recognise nowadays that that we're at a juncture now where, Holocaust Memorial Day around the world. It will not be long before the last Holocaust survivors have died, and we can't afford it just to become a page in the history books that will ultimately be forgotten. It's got to be kept alive. So, arguments in defence and against. In defence of Adenauer's policies did ensure stability in government. Okay, by bringing Nazis into government, it did allow West German democracy to grow and stabilise, and therefore the economic miracle. And the Germany we have today in the 21st century was built on those foundations. In defence of Adenauer's policies, he successfully avoided opening up the divisions which had so weakened the Weimar Republic, that by abandoning denazification and by allowing Nazis to take these key positions, he did successfully bring about social unity and eventually open the way to reunifications. In defence, as we said, many of these members of Adenauer's governments were not Nazi sympathisers. You can't simply say that all members of Adenauer's government were ex-Nazis. There were many members of his government who were not in any way associated with the Nazis. And yes, many high-ranking Nazi sympathisers were imprisoned as a result of Adenauer's policies. So it's very easy to sort of like end up with very simplistic, exaggerated arguments here. And often it is forgotten that, as we said, Adenauer banned the Socialist Reich Party. He did imprison many Nazi sympathisers. So we have to be balanced when we talk about Adenauer, as controversial as his policies were. And his policies were justifiable as the most appropriate and effective direction in that context. What he had to do at the time with the Cold War and the existence of a communist East Germany, and the genuine fear that East Germany may attack West Germany, he therefore had little choice, arguably, but to seek American support and to ensure that West Germany was stable so that it could resist communist expansion. Then you got the counter-argument, one of which is that West Germany could have functioned more effectively as a democracy if it had been more willing to confront Germany's past early on in the 1950s. E.g., a stronger pursuit of Nazis in the 50s would have resulted in more prosecutions at a time when there were more witnesses. It's very difficult with the passage of time. Witnesses die, and it became more and more difficult to do that. So if he'd pursued it more strongly and quickly, immediately, then more Nazis could have been brought to justice. Another counter-argument, Adenauer's approach meant ultimately that West Germany was built on a very questionable moral basis. And it's all very well saying it was a strong democratic country with an economic miracle, but that is always going to be there. It's tainted with a question mark. It was built on the basis of ex-Nazis occupying leading positions. And that's still an issue today. It's still a question mark over Germany today. It will always be there. There will always be that question mark, even though these people have now, on the whole, died, but nevertheless it is still there. And the final one, denazification was incompatible with the maintenance of social peace and the building of democracy in the early years of the of West Germany. Okay, so that's the debate since the 1960s. That's the end of that topic. It's a fascinating and controversial topic, and as you can see, it's one that certainly could be there could be an essay question in the examination. I hope that was useful to you.